When it comes to your retirement, do you want to have the same old plan everyone else has? Of course not. You're unique and have your own goals and dreams. Don't be treated just like a number. This is your retirement. So it's time to think differently. And you're in luck because you've found the Retire Your Way podcast with ILG Financial. At ILG Financial, you won't find generic, run-of-the-mill plans containing the same old cookie-cutter solutions. Dave, Chase, and the ILG Financial team focus on building one retirement at a time using their Think Differently philosophy. And that means your own comprehensive plan with customized solutions built to achieve just one goal, yours. So put on your Think Differently hats and get ready to take back control of your retirement today and for all the tomorrows to come. ILG Financial's Retire Your Way podcast was created just for you, and it's starting right now.
When it comes to retirement, do you want to have the same old plan everyone else has? Of course not. You're unique, and you have your own goals and dreams. Don't be treated just like a number. This is your retirement, so it's time to think differently. And you're in luck today because you found the Retire Your Way podcast with ILG Financial. Chase Lopez is here today. And if you'd like to get in touch with ILG Financial, it's easy. All you got to do is call them at 540-720-5656 or simply go online to ilgfinancial.com to find out more about today's topic. And today we have a very fascinating topic. You've worked hard, you saved hard for retirement, you tried to get everything right, and now you're retired, you're in a good place with your retirement accounts. Now comes the tricky part, spending your savings. Chase Lopez is going to speak with us today about the things that can trip people up when spending in retirement. It's a different mindset and how you can avoid those pitfalls. Chase, how's it going?
Oh, it's going great. Love doing the podcast. I think this topic here today is going to be very prudent for a lot of folks that are getting close to retirement. So I'm kind of eager to jump in and talk about it.
Oftentimes we talk about, getting to retirement, and today specifically we're going to discuss getting through retirement. And folks who are already retired have to think a little differently. Instead of setting aside investments and building your portfolio, today is when, you start taking money out, and that's kind of difficult for some folks. So why don't you lead us into this discussion?
Yeah, so I think you kind of set the foundation really well in that with anyone, and this is kind of across the board, with anyone, your financial life, it's kind of broken up into two distinct time frames or phases, as we kind of call them here at the office. The first is the accumulation phase of your financial life. And in the accumulation phase, all the rules for investing and saving are pretty much the same for everyone, right? Put in as much as you can. Don't touch the money and look for investments that give you the best average rate of return over time for retirement. Well, Now, once you hit this distribution phase, and typically with folks, this is kind of a general rule of thumb, but typically we tell folks that's about 5 to 7 years outside of when you're thinking you're going to retire. You are entering this distribution phase. And in this distribution phase, every penny you have saved will be distributed in some way, shape, or form. So whether that's, hey, you need it for income in retirement, hopefully some fun stuff, right? You get to take that vacation that you've always wanted or see that landmark that you've always dreamed of seeing. And then eventually, once you pass, those assets will be distributed to your heirs, but every penny over the 20 to 30 years of someone's retirement, every penny is going to be distributed. So that just introduces a whole new set of risks that you didn't have during the accumulation phase. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of those things that are kind of unique to the distribution phase. Just as a reminder, and I know we say this every time, Ron, but this is not meant as blanket advice or anything like that. We're going to speak a lot in generalities today. Ultimately, you should get with your financial professional to see exactly how each of these things are going to affect you as you hit this distribution phase.
When you get in touch with Chase or Dave at ILG Financial, that's when things will get really specific, but we have to talk in generalities basically on the podcast, but you can get much more specific and zero right in on what you need for your specific plan after that happens. We talked about a couple of things that can, pitfalls that can occur, and one of those things is underspending in retirement. What causes that, Chase, and how can folks avoid that?
Yeah, so and it's actually funny because underspending, I think a lot of people would say, hey, that sounds like a good problem to have, right?
Exactly.
But ultimately, it's kind of this underspending in retirement is kind of caused by two different uncertainties, right? So over the past 4 decades, really, over the past 40 years, for a lot of people, their entire working career, private employers have replaced pensions with 401k plans. So essentially what that means is now folks have to self-fund their own retirement, as opposed to in the olden days, right? When you retired, your company gave you a pension, maybe you got Social Security as well, and then maybe you worked for another company and got another pension from them. And that was really how your retirement was funded. Now it is that burden is placed on the individuals.
Now, basically, you're on your own, and you get a little help from your employer, but not as much as in the past.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And what that can cause is a lot of paralysis for people, right? It's, hey, I've saved this money, and we're so trained, right? It's so ingrained in us to continue to save this money and not to spend it, right? To sock it away. And what a lot of people don't kind of realize is you're saving the money, right? And you're doing everything you were told. You're putting away as much as you can. You're not touching it. But a lot of people don't end up finishing that sentence. And the end of that sentence is, why are you doing all that? Well, you're doing all of that to hopefully use it in retirement, right? A lot of people don't save money in their 401k just to see the number on a piece of paper go up, right? Mm-hmm. Ultimately, it's to be able to use this money. So with that said, as far as how much to spend and what's a good withdrawal rate for your specific situation, that's going to be for you and your financial professional to decide. But one thing to keep in mind is that it is possible to underspend in retirement based on some of the things that we just talked about.
Yeah, and it's easy to see why some people get nervous about, spending some of that money, and because they're their own pension plan managers, really. And, it's a whole different mindset than when you were getting to retirement, when you try and start getting through retirement. How about those with pensions in retirement? I mean, there are not a lot of them out there these days, but there's still some hanging on. What about those folks?
Yeah, so that's what's interesting about this conversation, Ron, is that actually people with pensions, when you contrast those people with pensions to folks that are just solely using the 401k, what you'd see is that folks with higher pension incomes actually tend to spend more. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because if you have a pension, you're not really worried about running out of money, right? It's, hey, this pension's guaranteed as long as I'm alive. I might as well spend the money, right? Yeah. So ultimately, it's more psychological than anything. It really doesn't have anything to do with the amount saved or anything like that. It's just the comfort of knowing, hey, I have a pension, so I'm able to save, this money. So we ran a little case study, or I shouldn't say we, but there is a case study out there, and it basically says that those with total retirement assets between $1 million and $3 million, including the present value calculations for Social Security and other pension-like income, those who received 20 to 40% of their retirement income from a pension-like income spent an average of $50,000 a year. Mm-hmm. Now, when you contrast that to those who had, let's say, 60 to 80% of their pension like income, or 60 to 80% of their income was pension like, they end up spending $71,000 per year. So that just shows you, hey, folks with a pension tend to enjoy this money a lot more than folks who don't necessarily have a pension. So what I'm trying to kind of hammer home here is there is a power to having this paycheck, right? And you can kind of build your own kind of quasi pension with a financial professional, right? And, by doing that, that will allow you to kind of enjoy a lot more of this money than you previously may have.
And I think you can certainly acquire a lot more clarity and confidence in your life if you have a plan put together by a professional like Chase Lopez. So, hey, get in touch with Chase and talk more about this, 540-720-5656. Now, there are steps that you can take to make your nest egg more like a pension. I mean, you can make it feel like a pension, and it can kind of act like a pension. How does one go about that, Chase?
There's a couple of pieces there, right? Ultimately, where your kind of financial professional can help you out is by putting those pieces together to kind of finish the puzzle. To use a terrible analogy, but I think it kind of works.
Yeah, and there's certain strategy involved, as always.
Exactly, right? And everyone's situation is a little bit different, right? But in general, here are some kind of good building blocks to kind of start off with. The first one is to figure out, hey, can I get my essential expenses to a number where my Social Security ends up covering those essential expenses, right? So let's say you're a couple, right? You and your spouse collectively bring in $40,000 a year from Social Security. And I'm just making that number up. Whatever that number ends up being, ideally, right, we want to make sure your essential expenses fall underneath that number. So when we talk about essential expenses, we're talking about things like groceries, gas, mortgage payments, or rent if you're renting. All of those things that basically you need those items in order to live, we would kind of consider those essential expenses. Now, the reason why that it can be so powerful for someone using their retirement plan, I should say, is that Social Security is cost of living adjusted. So as those essential expenses go up with things like inflation and things like that, your Social Security check will also go up as well in order to kind of compensate for some of that, price increase.
Yeah, and you can kind of, if you can get to a point where Social Security covers those essential items every month, you can kind of set that aside and not worry about it because, that's going to be kind of automatic. But what about if Social Security does not provide enough income? What should you do then?
Yeah, so in that case, right, you would probably want to create a income stream to augment or to add on to your Social Security check so that, or to the degree, to cover those expenses. So if we use that same $40,000 example I was talking about before, let's say your essential expenses end up being $45,000 and Social Security is covering $40,000. Well, what you want to do is make sure, hey, that $5,000 that I need, that is guaranteed for life, just like Social Security is. So a common way to do that is maybe using an annuity or something like that. Again, get with your financial professional to see if that's appropriate for you. But that is one way to kind of augment that difference between your Social Security and those essential expenses.
Everybody needs cash to a certain degree. And how does the need for cash, figure into this whole retirement plan for your regular income? I mean, you're going to have some emergency expenses and that kind of thing. You need certain things liquid, but how do you handle the cash bucket, so to speak?
Sure. So it's I would say in retirement, it's probably a little more prudent to have a little bit more cash on hand than maybe when you were working. And I would say the biggest reason for that is when you're in retirement, you're kind of on a fixed income, right? So the example that we were using before where you have Social Security and then you create your own pension in that scenario, if you have some sort of big expense to come up, so you got to do a repair at the house or, God forbid you need a new car or something like that, right? Something that comes up that's not necessarily in that essential expenses bucket, you want to make sure that you have some cash available to pay for these things. So, recommend between 6 months and 1 year of essential expenses kind of set aside in cash. And the reason why we say 6 months to a year is you don't necessarily want all of your money in, say, like the stock market, right? Especially in retirement, because if the stock market goes down and you need that new roof on your house or you need that, whatever that emergency expense ends up being, you don't want to have to sell your stocks at a loss to fund that purchase. So, I would say 6 months to a year worth of living expenses in that cash bucket to create that cushion for, any unexpected things to come up in retirement.
The next thing that comes to mind for me is something that people don't like to talk about and don't even like to think about. And that is the fact that most of us at some point in our lives are going to need some form of long-term care. And we know how much that is. We know how expensive that is, how it can absolutely devastate folks' portfolios. So how do you set aside money for long-term care and feel really confident that you're covered?
Yeah, so there's a couple of prongs to that, right? We've talked about this in the past, Ron. With us, we kind of specialize in working with folks in or near retirement. So this long-term care issue, we kind of see it every day, right? So sure. I think it's, to your point, it's a lot more common that someone's going to need long-term care than people think, right? Oftentimes it's what's the old phrase? Hey, it's not going to be me, right? It's just everybody else. But the unfortunate part is that, don't quote me on this exact stat, but I believe if for a married couple, there's a 70% chance that either one of those spouses will need long-term care at some point for some reason.
Pretty scary,
right?
isn't it?
Yeah. And ultimately, when you're building out your plan, the ideal way to build out that plan is to have this discussion before you need the long-term care, right?
Sure,
It's, hey, if you're going to need long-term care in the future, how are we going to attack this problem? Because the last thing you want to do is be making rash decisions when you need, long-term care, right? So there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. Traditional long-term care insurance was popular maybe 15 to 20 years ago. It has become a lot less popular now for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's very expensive, right? So the premiums are pretty expensive. And then number two, your premiums can actually go up. So if you're paying $100 a month today, it's very possible that your premiums could go up in the future. And that's because, long-term care expenses just continue to go up. Folks continue to live longer, right? Which doesn't mean, as you know, Ron, just because we're living longer doesn't mean, those last years of your life that you're not in a long-term care facility or something like that.
The good news is that people are living longer. The bad news is people are living
longer. No, that's
a whole lot more planning.
That's exactly right. So what we talk to a lot of folks about doing is considering self-funding or self-insuring yourself for long-term care. And we won't get into necessarily products here today, but there are multiple different ways where you can kind of self-fund your long-term care plan in advance so that, again, that when it does happen, it's not a huge drain on your portfolio and it doesn't drain all of your retirement savings.
And the good thing is, if you set it up in such a way, your money will continue to grow in the money that you've set aside for long-term care during your retirement, instead of taking a hit and being decimated by long-term care expenses. So Chase,
that's exactly right,
and Dave at Lopez can talk to you more about that. Again, you're listening to the Retire Your Way podcast at ILG Financial. 540-720-5656 is your number to call if you'd like to have a conversation with these guys about what's going on in your life. There's one controversial topic I wanted to bring up here today, and I've heard some really negative things about this, and I know that some folks speak positively about reverse mortgages. What is your feeling on a reverse mortgage?
Yeah, so you're right. There's a lot of different opinions out there about reverse mortgages and things like that. Here's the bottom line, and this is not really specific to reverse mortgages. You could probably say this about any sort of financial tool or investment or anything like that. It's not inherently good or bad, right? It's just it needs to be used in a very specific scenario. It's not something that a bunch of people should be doing, but in a specific scenario, it could be helpful. So in the past, we've talked about the 4% rule, which basically says, hey, you can take out about 4% out of your savings, out of your retirement savings annually, and you should be able to fund your full 30-year retirement. We've done a couple of other podcasts, a couple of other videos on our YouTube channel, Retire Your Way, that kind of talk about the 4% rule and why it may no longer be as effective as it was. But if you have a relatively small amount saved for retirement, the 4% rule may not be enough to sustain your lifestyle, right? Yeah. 4% of your portfolio may not be enough. So what a reverse mortgage does is it allows you to utilize that equity that you've built up in your house, as opposed to using a portfolio that maybe you just don't have, right? You just haven't saved it over time. Right. So it allows you to tap that equity and create an income stream essentially from that equity. Now, again, I'm not going to get into the minutia on how specifically a reverse mortgage works. If you think that may be an option, then I would strongly recommend getting in with your financial professional and seeing if it can be. But essentially, from a 10,000-foot view, you're using the equity to basically create an income stream for someone in retirement. Now, this option isn't free, right? There's a lot of fees to set up a reverse mortgage, usually run between $15,000 to $30,000, but it still has I think a 90% or better probability of lasting 30 years, which is, the typical time frame that we use for, retirement planning. So I guess big picture there, right? It can be useful, but in very specific circumstances, right? And you want to figure out if those specific circumstances apply to you.
No matter what you may have heard in the past, what your neighbor said or your friend or your relative, be sure you check out the specifics on this and talk to a professional about it so that you totally understand how it works. And really the same goes for retirement planning in general. There's a lot of misinformation out there. You can Google things and you can get yourself in a whole lot of trouble because a lot of things out there are written with a certain agenda in mind. And what you need to do is
exactly right.
Is to get with a professional and discuss these things. And my goodness, I would say you need to talk to Chase Lopez and get his feelings on all of these things and help. They can help you set up a plan specifically for your wants and desires and specifically for your scenario so you can get to and through retirement. Today we've been talking about a lot about getting through retirement. And it requires a different mindset when you start actually spending that money that you've been accumulating over all the periods of time. And so, it's a different psychological thing. Chase, what can you say to kind of wrap up this conversation today?
Yeah, so I think it kind of harkens back to something that you had mentioned just right then, and then what we had mentioned at the top of the podcast here, which is it is a big paradigm shift with people, right? Moving from this accumulation phase to this distribution phase can be scary, right? It can be, we're very used to a paycheck, for 30 or 40 years of our lives. And, now you're kind of out there on it on your own, right? I always say this to folks, which is when you retire, this is your first time retiring, right? When you get with your financial professional, when you get with your financial advisor, they've helped hundreds of folks kind of navigate this new phase of their life. And I would just lean on them for that expertise to make sure you're not missing any critical pieces of information or anything, falling through the cracks.
Gosh, you brought up a lot of good things today, and I know you're going to hear from a lot of folks after they listen to this podcast, because particularly when it comes to long-term care and all that sort of thing. And a lot of people don't necessarily want to discuss those items, but it is so essential for everybody to understand exactly what's going on. And Chase, appreciate your being here today and informing everybody.
Oh, Ron, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for keeping me on track, as you always do. And we'll talk to everybody next time.
Now you are one step closer to learning what a customized retirement strategy can do for you with the folks at ILG Financial. Income, legacy, growth. It's all right here at ILG, and it's about helping you plan for retirement your way so you can achieve your financial goals. Get in touch with ILG Financial today, 540-720-5656, or as always, you can go online to ilgfinancial.com to learn a lot more. You've been listening to the Retire Your Way podcast. I'm Ron Stutz with Chase Lopez. The information provided is for educational purposes only and is not intended as investment advice for any individual or entity. All information contained herein is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. The views presented today are those of Dave Lopez and do not necessarily represent the views of the Alpha Star Capital Management, LLC. The opinions expressed are subject to change without notice and do not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice. Please consult your financial professional before executing any financial strategy. Investment advisory services offered through Alpha Star Capital Management, LLC, a registered investment advisor. Alpha Star and ILG Financial, LLC are independent entities. SEC registration does not constitute an endorsement of the firm by the Commission, nor does it indicate that the advisor has attained a particular level of skill or ability.